Okay, something magical has happened in Mr. Land.
Ooh, I love magical stuff. Let me guess. If you send a note and a self-addressed stamped envelope, then the Mr. people will send you a free Mr. of your choice with your choice of add-ons for the next 10 days only.
Self-addressed stamped envelope is not a phrase I've heard since probably the mid-90s.
You don't work in the realm of SASEs anymore?
No, not buying a lot of cereal that gives away action figures anymore.
You didn't have to send, I guess you did have to send had to send a sassy for those sometimes.
Yeah, well, maybe not for packaged goods.
What was the best action figure you got for free?
Oh, I don't know if I ever sent off or anything. I probably did.
I got Yak Face from Return of the Jedi.
Yak Face?
Yeah, he was one of the Jabba's Palace aliens. I got him and I got an Emperor, I think.
Yakface.com, serving Star Wars collectors worldwide, says... Oh, there's way too many action figures in here. Anyway.
There were a ton that you could mail off for, yeah.
Yes.
Like Boba Fett was a mail-off one at first.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. I think that mail-in Boba Fett is like maybe the most valuable Star Wars toy that exists.
That was like a thing that you could actually, like the most valuable ones are the Boba Fetts that had the actual shooting backpack rocket.
Yeah, like the one, because those didn't make it to the market?
There's only like 7 of them or something, yeah.
Anyway.
But yeah, those mail-off Boba Fett's worth quite a bit.
Well, anyway, the Mister.
Yeah, back to the Mister, though.
The magical thing that's happened is somebody has cloned the DE10 Nano, the board that forms the basis of the Mister.
What do you mean cloned? You mean they took the same FPGA and the same ARM chip and jammed them on a board together? And
so same FPGA, yes, but not same board design.
Okay.
So here's what happened is this person, Taki Udon, is a person in the Mister community who I was not super familiar with, but they posted on Twitter like a week ago a picture of a DE10. So the DE10 Nano is it's made by Terasic, subsidized by Intel. It's a student like academic development board for FPGA stuff. And that's why it became the basis of the Mister project, because it was subsidized for academic purposes, blah, blah, blah.
Available and inexpensive.
People know the story. It is way less inexpensive than it used to be. It's like pushing $250 now. I think you can at least get them now because for a while it was pushing $250 and you couldn't even find them. I think they are purchasable now, but the price is inflated so much that it's kind of started growing out of reach of what people want to spend on an emulation retro device, right?
Wow. Yeah, they've gotten really expensive. Even on Mr. Add-ons, they're $250 and they are currently unavailable.
Yes. So this clone that Taki Unon posted a picture of, it's not the exact same board layout. It's very similar. It's the same size, the same form factor, but you can see looking at it, there are fewer traces, there are fewer resistors, whatever on there. Like there's just less stuff on the board. And some of the ports have been changed as well, but it is that same SoC. The SoC on that thing is made by Altera. It's called the Cyclone 5, which is both the FPGA and there's a single ARM core on that same chip, which is what runs the Linux in that thing that handles file I/O and networking and stuff like that. So everybody looked at that and was like, how is this possible? Because if you go to, I can't remember if I went to DigiKey or Mouse or one or the other. If you go look up the Cyclone 5 on, I think it was DigiKey that I looked at, the chip alone, they are selling for $325.
Like just the bare chip, not attached to a board.
Just the FPGA.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So people were like, what are you doing? Are you harvesting FPGAs off of defective or like end-of-life devices that you're getting your hands on? Because that happens, people harvest ICs all the time off of old stuff to repurpose.
That's where all the Mr. SDRAM kits come from, for the most part.
Or people were like, are you using some kind of weird clone that might not be reliable or might be inferior in some way? So finally, somebody tweeted at him about that issue, and he was just like, they were like, hey, you're selling this Mr. Clone for way less than just this chip costs. And he was like, yeah, that's the narrative that's going around, but Altera actually gave an incredibly good competitive price at bulk order volume. Basically saying like this thing is worth, or this thing costs way, way, way less than you think it does based on what these like small batch parts sellers are dealing in. So this kind of changes everything in that scene.
Yeah, because like a $99 board in there means you can build a Mister for what the D10 Nano board costs right now, basically.
Also, there's multiple components to this. Actually, yes, what you just said is the first one. It's just going to be way, way lower cost of entry to get into this thing now because it's a $99 board. They have also redesigned the SD RAM that usually goes for upwards of $60 to $15.
Oh, thank God.
So a full Mister setup now is, assuming all this works, is going to cost $115. Full meaning like bare bones, like you can play games on it, but that's about it.
But then the other thing is if we're not relying on that D10 Nano board, we can also do things like build different form factors like the...
That is exactly it. So that's what's really exciting about this. But before I even get to that, like even this first clone board they're working on, they've made some minor improvements that even there are going to be huge. Like You had to get your own USB OTG hub to plug into the DE10 because the DE10 can't take just like a controller. You can't just plug that in and have it see a USB device. It needs which costs like $50 if you get the nice USB hub board add-on.
Yeah.
They've built the OTG hub right into this clone port and put a USB-A port on it. You don't even need a USB hub anymore. You can buy this board and that RAM and plug a controller straight into this thing. The point is they're making little design improvements. Or to step back, the real point is now they are no longer beholden to whatever dev boards are coming out of Jurassic or Xilinx or whoever they would have had to repurpose like expensive dev boards from in the past. Now they can build their own boards, purpose designed to spec exactly what they want.
For old computer and video game emulation. That is fantastic.
The FPGA is the only thing on that thing that actually really matters, that actually cost money and that was hard to get. Now that thing apparently is not hard to get or expensive anymore, the community can just start building its own boards around that chip to do exactly what they want and nothing else.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so we're basically going to start getting boards now that do more and cost less because they don't have all the stuff on that development board you didn't need, but they do have stuff that wouldn't have been on there.
So does that mean also we'll see like handheld stuff?
Yes. So he's already said flat out, he's like, hey, this clone board that is the same form factor that aims to just be 100% compatible with the real thing is going to come first. Then we are working on a much more elaborate board in a console style form factor that's going to have a lot more stuff built into it. So like he already said on the Mr. Discord, like the RAM is going to be built into that board, but you can imagine what else they might put in there. Like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth could be built in because you need adapters for that right now.
There's no reason you couldn't put like the D-pads and buttons on and triggers and stuff on there.
Well, so I fully expect one of these nice console style versions to have all the analog video output hardware built in because right now you have to get yet another add-on board to add that. So they could just put like the VGA output, the analog video out right on that thing.
What bus does the analog video go? Does it go to I2 over I2C or something, or is it on some other weird bus?
It goes over the GPIO headers, so maybe that is I2C. I'm not sure,
but it's probably they're just saying, hey, the GPIO these headers are the analog driver outs, right?
Yeah, so that is actually the big quandary right now. Is you can only have either the analog video out or a second stick of RAM, which second stick of RAM is not that useful right now. But there are some very limited use cases for. Anyway, the sky is the limit now for what they are going to be able to just build themselves for this project.
This is exciting.
It's super exciting. A handheld, they already flat out said after that console thing we're doing, we're going to make a handheld.
Wow.
Because this thing also uses less power than the DE10 because they're using better like power switching hardware or whatever.
So how does this new FPGA compare in terms of performance to the? Is it the same? It's the same Cyclone 5.
Exact same chip.
Okay.
Yeah. Exact same. Like it runs the same software. He said they didn't even have to like fork the Mr. software and tweak anything. It's running the stock stuff.
Okay. So then where does this leave the cores that we can't run on the current D10 Nano? Probably the same place. Like we're gonna have the same upper limit on this.
Yeah. Same chip, same logic elements, same everything. And they're going for 100% compatibility. So it'll have all the same drawbacks for now. The thing, maybe more learned people can step in here and add some context, but the thing that really jumps out to me, though, now is like what happens when a better FPGA hits this kind of low, sensible volume pricing, where now you don't need to wait for some company to put out an $800 development board that happens to have a better FPGA on it. If you can just get those chips directly, then like the successor to the Mister could just be built to purpose, right?
Is this just happening now because somebody like called whoever makes the Cyclone and was like, hey, we'd like to buy some of those? Or like presumably somebody had to write a check for them to get bulk pricing on this, right?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like they contacted the manufacturer directly, but by all accounts, it was all just driven by the fact that the prices just keep going up on this stuff rather than down.
I guess that when the prices keep going up, there's a place where the line between the current price of the existing thing and the cost of making a new thing cross.
Yeah.
And then it makes sense to start making the new thing.
Yeah, I mean,
man, that's cool.
It's awesome. I mean, my Mr. setup when I got in was like $220 all in for everything, and now you regularly see bundles going around for like $600. Granted, that has like kind of everything you could possibly get for it, but there's this Mars project they're saying is going to be like $700. Like it was just like this race to the top.
What's the name of the new board?
There is no name yet. Like there's just kind of I'll throw a link to that video in the show notes for this, where he kind of talks through his methodology and design philosophy and stuff. I should offer a caveat here. Probably, I don't think this person has actually really delivered any kind of hardware in this scene yet before. So this could be all a bunch of nonsense, smoke and mirrors until we have products in our hands and we can test them and everything. But he did post a video of the prototype hooked up and working yesterday. So it's like, seems pretty legit so far. But like, just to summarize though, it's like a week or two ago, the whole Mr. project felt kind of stagnant, especially on the hardware side. Like there just hasn't really been much going on other than like some incremental progress on cores here and there, but especially like hardware wise, like it's just kind of been the hardware for the last like 2-3 years. And all of a sudden, like now out of nowhere now, it's like we've got a $100 Mister coming. We've got a big elaborate like console all-in-one form factor with all the features built into it. And he's even saying that console thing has got like one big new feature that is a secret that nobody has done before, and I have no idea what that's even going to be. Then a handheld, which he actually just said on the Discord is dockable. So that's probably going to be like a Switch analog pocket situation where you can play it handheld and plug it into a TV. And then there's like, I didn't even mention, there's 2 more like lower cost, reduced feature set consoles coming by, like all of this by the end of the year. And who knows like what the Mister 2 could be built around a whole new FPGA at some point, now that this seems like it might be possible from a supply chain standpoint. It's just like a crazy amount of stuff happening at once, which again, granted, is all being promised by one person. But if all this stuff pans out, it's going to be like retro game Christmas.
Welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad. Hello.
I'm a little hoarse. I was doing some screaming this morning.
I am also a bit hoarse. some hijinks, some subterranean hijinks were happening.
I play those kinds of games and I'm like, I'm not going to do the screaming thing. And then they're very good at the jump scares and you end up screaming and usually dying. In my case, I think you were more effective at running away usually.
Oh, you're also doing it for the likes though.
That's true. I mean, if I get the likes, if I get those, if people like and subscribe, any amount of physical harm is worth it.
Yes. What good is your life if you don't have likes?
That's grim.
We were playing Content Warning, we should say.
Yeah, we were playing Content Warning on Nextlander this morning.
Pretty awesome, which is basically Lethal Company, except instead of trying to get scrap, you're trying to record your friends dying for social media clout.
And speaking of home video formats.
Okay, all right. Nice.
Bringing it on back to the good old days. We had a request. Several users asked us to dig into this over the last several months, so I'm not going to name anyone in particular, but we had a request for an episode about video formats, home video media formats specifically.
History of home video, I guess.
Yeah, and we started doing the research on this and realized there's a lot, actually, kind of a shocking amount to talk about, starting with like, you know, a little bit of reel-to-reel film, like 16 8mm film, going all the way through. So we're gonna do this in 2 parts. I don't know if we're gonna do them back to back, but we're gonna do them in 2 parts. Where the first one is the analog formats, and then when it jumps over to the digital formats, we're gonna take a pause, and then we're gonna do that as a separate thing, because in some ways the analog stuff is really weird and like there's a lot of choices made in the 70s and 80s.
The real Wild West kind of vibe to everything, for sure.
Yeah, but also like the dawn of DVD and digital 8 and all those kind of digital tape formats felt like the beginning of the modern age in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like where we were just distributing the bits on discs instead of over the internet like we do now.
Yeah, there's kind of a tidy dividing line, I think, between this analog era and when digital stuff started catching on. I mean, probably mid 90s, but like 97 with DVD is kind of the real beginning of this second era. So I guess we'll be going up to kind of right before that.
Yeah, that sounds right. So we're looking at specifically stuff that was meant for home. So we're not going to talk about like commercial Betamax or commercial SVHS or old reel-to-reel tapes or anything like that.
I do have this Betacam Wikipedia tab open.
Okay, so we can talk about Betacam for a sec, just because, like, you know. Yeah. Anyway, but for the most part, it's stuff that's designed to hook up to a TV and watch at home, whether it's pre-recorded or something that you record yourself, like in terms of camcorder, stuff like that.
Yeah. Because like today it is utterly impossible to remember this, but I think even when you and I were growing up, or I mean, you're like 4 years older than me.
I was born in 75.
You probably remember maybe a little better than I do a time before you could watch video on demand at home in any way whatsoever. Like I barely even remember that, because by the time I have memories, we had a VCR in the house, right? But like it was not much before that you watched what was on broadcast TV, or you watched nothing.
So when I remember explicitly, there's 2 early VHS memories that I have. One is that in like 1981, when I was probably 6 years old, the guy who my dad, the guy who had the office, kind of like his office neighbor across the street from his realtor shop, ran a copying machine company, and he always bought new technology stuff. And he loaned us his portable VHS kit, which came in 2 like shoulder sling bags that had a giant fat connector between them. And one had the tape unit in it, and one was the thing that you hooked up to the TV. And he gave us a copy of, I think, The Black Hole, which we watched when I was 6 years old, and it scared the living shit out of me. The other one was when I went to my grandparents' house that same year, probably maybe the year after. They had a tape player that I assume, I don't know how they did it actually, but it had a button you could press that would record what you were playing on the tape to some sort of internal buffer, which I assume was just a tape that was permanently built into the box. And then you could rewind that and play that back and record it on another tape. So you could do a 2-generation dupe of a tape, which seems like the kind of thing that would have gotten you in trouble with the law, with the studios back then, because it was definitely meant for duplication. But anyway, so
Wild
those
West.
are my 2. Yeah, we did that. I feel like I made a copy of Buck Rogers for my grandmother because she liked Buck Rogers.
A noble purpose. Our first VCR was one of those 2-unit doohickeys. I mean, like the one, one side was literally just the tape deck and kind of nothing else, and the other side, I guess, was the sort of tuner and playback kind of.
Well, back then they were all top loading, right? Those two side ones were definitely the one that we borrowed was a top loader. You had to put it in the top and then smash the thing down. But before all that, there was home film. Home film was wildly popular in the 60s and 70s. It was kind of expensive because, you had to get 1 million little pictures developed every time you sent a piece of a film in. You usually had to mail it off someplace. But cameras, projectors, and development were things that you could order from like Sears or whatever, and you'd get your camera and your projector, and then for like around the modern equivalent of $1,000, they were a couple $100 in most cases. You could record video and send it off someplace, and it'd come back 2 weeks later, and you could watch videos of your family as if they were shot by cinematographers and auteurs in Hollywood.
Or you could record films.
I wonder, did I say videos?
Yes, you said videos, and I wonder, that makes me wonder, like, what was the genesis of the word video, and when did that actually come into common usage? Because back then it was films generally, right? Or movies that people would say, but like, where did the word video come from, and when did that become?
I wonder if video had to do with because for a long time, if you think about it, like the ability to record TV was a real innovation. A lot for much of the first 15 years of TV, in a lot of cases, the shows were literally broadcast and blasted out of the airwaves, and there was no method to record them other than pointing a camera at a screen, a film camera at the screen, right? So you either did things on film, shot things on film, and then did a telescene where you projected the film onto a wall and used the video camera to show that, or you did a straight live broadcast of whatever it was you were showing. Did you find some stuff about video?
Yes.
You look like you're a man who has information.
At least according to the online etymology dictionary, the word video was coined in 1935 as a visual equivalent of audio from a Latin word that's spelled the same way. How's your Latin?
I took 4 years in high school.
VIDEO.
Yeah, that reads, that's video, I believe.
This is also just pronounced video. Latin?
A video is, I think, to see, vidi.
Yes, it translates to I see. But how would you pronounce it?
Well, it's a dead language, so we have no idea.
Oh, really? Is it actually?
Yeah, if you want to know how to pronounce Latin, you have to ask somebody who's Catholic. I am not. I just took Latin in high school.
I thought Latin pronunciation was still at least somewhat understood. Oh, wait, actually,
I'm sure it is, but
actually,
4 years in high school.
Yeah, haven't I seen some arguments about how a C is pronounced in Latin? Like, isn't there disagreement?
Cuz versus there's no s sound. I think is the
Anyway,
there's a lot of stuff. There's like J's or depending on whether you learn Latin, ecclesiastical Latin or classical Latin, depends on how you pronounce the C's and the J's and stuff like that. I have some questions about Indiana Jones 3 as a result of this, just for the
fair. And anyway, like the history of like film stock and cinema and all that stuff, obviously way out of scope for this podcast, but it probably goes without saying that these 50s, 60s, well, mainly 60s, right? You said is when this stuff became big, but these like 60s and 70s film formats are just smaller, less capable versions of the same things they were projecting and filming movies on since the beginning of time?
Kind of. I mean, there were three main home uses. There was 16 millimeter, which is based on the cheap film standard. It's a cheaper film standard. It was introduced in 1923. The big thing about that is that film stock back then was a nitrate base, which was basically meant you were carrying canisters full of bombs around. And the acetate base would burn, but not quite as enthusiastically. 24 frames per second, just like 35 mil, like Clerks and Scrubs and Moonrise Kingdom and a bunch of movies are shot on 16 mil film still. 8 millimeter was released in 1932. It was even cheaper than 8 millimeter. Usually you ran that at than 16 millimeter. Sorry. Usually you ran that at 16 frames per second. This was the one that was popular at home most. It was the film was pretty cheap. There was sound available on a magnetic track or on a light track on the side.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea about that.
Yeah. And it was discontinued in 92, which presumably VHS was the final nail in the coffin of 8 millimeter. And then Super 8 was 8 millimeter film that had smaller perforation. So there's a bit more image space on either side of the frame. And it came in a cartridge, so it was easier you didn't have to thread stuff through.
Okay. Yes, I guess I have seen those types of cameras that have the little cartridge thing.
Yeah, it had a little hook thing that you smacked down and it just kind of fed it automatically. It also did sound and usually was 18 frames a second as well.
Probably in the major motion picture Super 8 is where I saw a Super 8 camera. If I had to guess.
Oh, maybe.
Among other places. But I did not realize there were home film solutions for capturing sound back then. Like my mom has a family friend, or like had a family friend. This was like more, or like my grandparents' family friend, but he passed away some years ago, and his son, going through his things later, found a reel of what I guess must have been 16 millimeter film and had it developed, or maybe it had already been developed anyway. Nobody knew what was on it until they projected it. And it turned out to be a bunch of footage of my grandparents in their 30s and my mom when she was like 7.
Oh man.
But that had no sound, so I associate, or maybe it's like a Wonder Years thing as well, right? Like I just associate that 50s, 60s type of home movie shot on film as having no sound.
So from what I could tell, the sound added a lot of cost. You think about what microphones were like back then.
Sure.
I don't believe my family's home movies from that time did not have sound either. When we had them digitized to VHS or DVD or whatever, the people who did the digitization picked like stock music and put like, if it was like a kid playing, there'd be some sort of rambunctious kind of xylophone music. It was funny.
That's exactly what we got with whoever they sent that thing off to. And the first thing I did was just mute it while I was watching it.
Yeah, that seems right. So then before that, there was reel-to-reel tapes, which were after that, rather, there were reel-to-reel tapes, which were analog magnetic tapes. They were available for consumers, but they were not particularly common. They were fiddly because you had to thread the tape manually through the read and write heads. And people mostly used them to record stuff off of the TV. They were much more common in a professional context where they would record the networks would broadcast stuff over satellite or microwave feeds to their affiliates, and they'd record those transmissions, and then they'd air them when it was time to show, Ozzie and Harriet or whatever, Leave It to Beaver in the afternoon. Probably Star Trek is a better example. Syndicated stuff. To
be clear, we're talking about the big classic console with 2 gigantic reels that are just kind of exposed to the air with the tape between them, that you kind of know what those look like in your mind's eye. But I didn't know you could do video on those. I always thought those were just for audio.
Well, I mean, they're just tape, right?
Yeah. But you have to have something to interpret what's on the tape, right? And I didn't realize that had been developed at that time for video.
Well, so that happened in this. I didn't actually find out. I didn't look to see when that was, but my recollection is that was during the 60s or late 50s that we got the ability to easily record stuff without using film.
Sure.
So that takes us up to probably the late 60s, early 70s. A lot of like 8 millimeter and Super 8 were often used for like news journalists. 16 mil also was used for journalists. The rise of tape cassettes, was the invention of tape cassettes, is the next big thing, because it took all that mechanism that was in the reel to reel and put it in a container that let it automatically thread the read and write heads through the tape in a way that made it simpler to use, basically.
And you can see why removing the potential for user error is huge in that situation, as fragile as tape is and as fiddly as it would be to have to string it between reels all the time and not screw it up.
Exactly. And that brings us to the Great Video War, which everybody knows about. It was, for all intents and purposes, the first format war. There were two functionally identical products, one that was open and one that was closed. Betamax was originally released in 1975, 5 days before I was born.
Mm-hmm.
It was the very first in the long line of Sony products that was pitched as, this is the good one, which is why it's more expensive.
Boy, that's like the entire theme of Sony consumer electronics for as long as I've known them.
Yep. It's worked sometimes and sometimes not so much.
I mean, look, those TVs were very good, like the Walkman, the Discman, they have made a lot of good products over the years.
The Bravia TVs, they made a lot of money on. Turns out in this case, nobody cared. Not really. Technically, it was pretty similar to VHS. There were 250. So important note here on analog video formats, we measure the lines of light and dark, like the dark, the bright, the resolution of the black and white, or like light intensity parts of the picture separately from the color information, the chroma. So luminance is the luminance is the light and dark, chroma is the color. And typically this split in beta is pretty representative. It's 250 lines of luma resolution, the black and white, because that's what our eyes are more sensitive to, and 30 lines equivalent of chroma. So like if we're talking about a digital image, it would be 333 by 486 pixels of luminance, 40 by 486 of chroma.
Yeah, I thought this 40 by 486 in the notes was a typo. Like I would never have guessed the ratio was that big.
If you think about it, we're just getting the color blobs in the right spot, and then your brain looks at what's light and what's dark, and it works itself out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we've talked about this before. I figured it was kind of that's a cognitive, like neurological perception thing, right? The brain just kind of makes it work.
It's that our brains are really good at detecting light and dark spots from each other, and kind of crappy at color, is my understanding.
Sure.
And so these are this information is contained in some bands on the tape. So like a certain number of megahertz goes to luminance, a certain number of megahertz goes to chroma, and then a little bit goes to audio. The higher quality argument was based entirely on the write head speed of the player spinning faster than VHS, which theoretically gave the player more bandwidth. It had a little bit more resolution, but not that much. But the main thing, so there's two things. One is that the reason it's called Betamax is because the mechanism that the tape head uses that pulls the tape out of the machine basically jammed a thing up in the hole in the back of the tape cassette, and then pulled the tape all the way around the read head so it could get to both the inside and the outside, and it made a shape that looked like the Greek letter beta.
Okay.
In the inside the machine, if you look at it from the top down.
Sure. That's as good a reason to name it that as any.
I'm going to put some show notes in here. There's a link in the show notes to some YouTube videos that show the transport mechanisms. Technology Connections has done a bunch on this over the years. But let's see if I can embed the video. I should have done this before we started. It's really amazing. I had no idea how these worked. And it makes me really appreciate the front-loading VCR as an innovation more than I ever did as a youth. Now, as is often the case, the VHS format, it does basically the same thing. They started working on this in the early 70s and released it in 76. It was pitched as an open competitor to Sony's licensed Betamax, so you could join the coalition and get cross-licensing or whatever with everybody else who's working in there.
Versus, just to be clear, to make a beta deck, you had to pay Sony royalties, licensing fees.
You had to pay licensing on each unit sold, probably to Sony. They had 12 objectives when they set out to make this. JVC started this. They wanted the system to be compatible with any ordinary TVs. The picture quality had to be similar to a normal air broadcast. The tape must have at least a 2-hour-long recording capacity. Tapes must be interchangeable between machines. That means like you can record on yours and hand it to me and I can play it on mine. The overall system should be versatile meaning it can be scaled and expanded, such as adding video cameras or dubbing between two recorders, etc. Recorders should be affordable, easy to operate, and have low maintenance costs. And the recorders must be capable of being produced in high volume. Their parts must be interchangeable, and they must be easy to service. Pretty straightforward stuff.
It's like a noble list of goals, with the possible exception of picture quality must be similar to a normal over-the-air broadcast, which, like, kind of stretching the definition of similar a little bit, but sure.
I mean, look, the VHS recording was, in the era of the tubes that they were making in 1976, probably looked similar.
Yeah, fair.
I think as the tubes got higher dot pitches and stuff like that, and the TVs got bigger, the weaknesses of them started to show themselves more, would be my guess.
Yeah, that's fair. I just looked up what became of JVC, if they're still a thing or not. They technically are, but they're now part of JVC Kenwood Holdings Incorporated. I don't feel like JVC is much of a consumer-facing brand these days.
I do not think that they are anymore. So let's see. They did this. They released these in 1976. The image quality format is a function of the bandwidth they used on the recording multiplied by the tape speed. It works. The other thing that uses the chroma subsampling, where it separates out the brightness and color info, is the JPEG spec.
Yeah, it's funny. I just saw that in a YouTube video like 2 days before we recorded this podcast. Somebody talking about that's exactly how JPEG image compression works.
So the other thing that happened here is that they allowed for different tape speeds. So they identified early that users were going to care about a number, and they picked the right one. So they, by doing standard play, medium play, extended play, and super long play speeds.
I was just you didn't write them in the notes. I was going to challenge you to name them, but you just did. Except, was there an MP? I know there was standard play, long play.
It was either long play or extended play, depending on your VCR, I think, probably. But the point was, you either got 2 hours, 4 hours, or 6 hours on a standard tape.
Right.
And that difference in record speed, meaning by running the tape through the head slower and thus degrading your picture quality even further, but letting you jam more stuff onto your $5 blank tape, turned out to be a real important decision.
Man. Yeah. You're really taking me back now that I think about it. Like, it was, for me, it was 6 hours per tape or nothing. It was just like, I've got to cram as much as I can on this thing.
I set The Simpsons to record every day. It was on 3 times a day when I was in college, and I just recorded an hour and a half of Simpsons every single day. Did
you end up with like a full library eventually, or close to it?
I had a big chunk from the syndication, whatever was in syndication at the time, through like season 9 or something.
It's pretty impressive. I checked. It's SP, LP, and EP.
SP, LP, and EP. Okay.
Extended play.
So I'm pretty sure my VCR, which I have behind me, was super long play, is what they called that.
Wait, like your classic, your VCR of record, the VCR of antiquity? Still have?
I have the VCR that I bought when I went to college. Right here.
Okay, well, now I've got to fill, because he's turning around and picking up what is sure to be a chunky piece of 80s, maybe 90s. You went to college.
90s, thank you.
Sure.
So it's right here. I want to give you the sound, though. I want to play the sound that plays when you load the tape into this thing, because it's a good sound.
That's a reasonably svelte piece of electronics for the era. Here we go.
Did it come through? Or no?
Yes. That was pretty good.
I'm going to put one in. So that sound is a much simpler tape extraction mechanism. They had a larger groove in the back of VHS tapes. Smaller groove, but with multiple places. And what happened was these pins went up and pulled it up and wrapped it around the tape head. So a lot less tape had to come out, which meant there had to be a lot less slack at the beginning and end of the tapes.
Interesting.
But it also meant that it was more straightforward. It was just a more straightforward mechanism, frankly.
Sure.
The cartridges were a little bit bigger for the VHS than the Betamax physically. And yeah, like I said, they did the multiple speeds. So, but I would encourage everybody to load up this YouTube link in the chat. I'm going to send it to you right now, Brad.
In the show notes.
In the chat. Jesus, I'm so tired.
Too much time on Twitch.
Too many words today. Let me find the right time code for you here.
Did you just say too many words?
Too many words today.
And can we sidebar here? This just occurred to me. Do you think it's possible that you have a finite number of words that you can speak per day, and then they start going in random directions after that?
That is 100% not just a theory. I would say that is fact. Okay, so I'm going to send you this link. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a countdown, and I think we should watch this together because it's pretty good and it's going to blow your mind. Okay, in 3, 2, 1, play.
Now we're going to watch what happens when all these mechanisms fire up. You'll first see the loading motor start to turn down here.
That's a lot of parts.
And then you'll see the tape get extracted from the cassette and wound around the head drum. So as I put the cassette in, there goes the cassette. And the tape is pulled around the head drum 180 degrees. The head drum spins at 1,800 revolutions per minute.
1,800 RPM.
1,800 RPM. That guy talks exactly like someone who makes a habit of getting inside VCRs.
We have a picture on the screen.
To me.
Yeah, that's it. You can stop now, but yeah.
You're right, though. Like, that's very little slack to have to pull. Like, it's only maybe, a couple inches, maybe? Can't see much scale reference in here because it's up close, but it doesn't look like it's very little tape that has to be pulled out from the tape.
Okay, so the VHS one, it's really straightforward. It grabs it wraps around the read-write head, and it pulls out like an extra 5 inches of tape, probably. The beta one has a pin that grabs the tape and wraps it all the way around. It needs to have 180 degrees of contact with the read-write head in order for the machine to work. And since the technology underlying the VHS is the same, the VHS uses 2 pins to pull it around and pulls it just past the midway point of the read-write head drum, which is a cylinder in the middle of the player. The beta one has 1 pin on a gear that goes around the outside edge of the read-write head and pulls it through like 270 degrees of that read-write circle, so that a big giant chunk of tape ends up rubbed against the drum, which spins again at like 1,800 revolutions per minute.
Yeah, I mean, if you visualize how much tape you would need to pull out to be able to make a reasonable looking REEC letter beta,
it's like twice as much as the VHS, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, you can imagine how much more tape would have to come out just to do that.
Well, and the knock-on effect of that is that it means that there's, in a cartridge that starts smaller than the VHS cartridge, there's extra space that's used for the extra slack that has to be at the beginning before the first recording to give enough blank, not tape at that point. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that do to make sure that the it didn't crash into the end of the tape and all that stuff. The Technology Connections video is definitely worth watching if you're interested in this stuff. There's a bunch of weird esoterica about how both of these formats work that make it a very interesting read.
Yeah, that channel does good work.
So, okay. So that's where the tapes are out. Everything's great. None of the content creators are upset about the fact that you can suddenly copy movies and TV shows at home, right?
Definitely. They don't want to exercise an iron grip over how and when and how often people watch their stuff without paying for it.
Turns out that's not right. Sony was sued by Universal Studios in 1984, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the famous Betamax case, is what people call this. And it resulted in a legal determination that home taping of of TV shows for the purposes of time shifting them was a legal fair use of copyrighted materials, because there were significant and thus that home video cassette recorders were legal technologies because of significant non-infringing uses.
Can you imagine how different the entire history of home media would be if this decision had gone the other way?
I mean, I think that we would have had there would have been a quashing effect on a lot of on computing.
Yes.
Like the internet and computing would have had problems if it was determined that we could ban entire branches of technology because of copyright infringement against movie studios.
Right. Like how many innovations and inventions just would never have even been pursued because of this legal sort of Damocles hanging over everything.
And just to be clear, it wasn't that there was an expectation there was going to be a ban. The idea was that the studios felt that the manufacturers were liable for any copyright infringement committed by purchasers of the devices, which would have not banned them from a legal sense, but would have prevented them from making them or required them to do major work to make sure that you couldn't actually record anything useful with them.
Right.
So that the good news is the Supreme Court went the right way on that. It established the fair use doctrine that allowed you to copy media that you had legal access to, which, just to be clear, not a law. It's just the Supreme Court said, hey, this is cool 40 years ago. And like, that's never backfired on us in any way, shape, or form. When the Supreme Court says something's okay and then changes their mind later. I'm looking at the camera. But yeah, so that's basically where the tape stuff ends. Right. Now,
but it did not stop them from developing copy protection for tapes anyway.
I was going to say that was the next step, is that they did have to develop copy protection for tapes. So the Macrovision analog protection system was a relatively simple copy protection that rendered copies garbled or unwatchable by jacking up the automatic gain circuit on recording devices. What this means is in the blank space on each analog frame, there was some blank space above and below the picture that was used for things like VSync and gain and stuff like that. What they would do is spike the gain signal on a purchase tape. Like if you bought a copy of a Tango and Cash, they would have the tape that you bought had these juiced gain pulses on there that would jack up the tracking on subsequent recordings. So the first one would look fine when you played it on most VCRs. Of course, it didn't work on all VCRs. This would jack up some VCRs. But on the second one, it would say, hey, this is not something we can do. This signal means it's not legal for us to make a copy of it. It just wouldn't work, or it would be badly corrupted.
I have not heard the word Macrovision in 25 years or more.
I feel like there was a version of Macrovision on a lot of DVDs. That's in possible. Addition to the DVD CCA stuff.
That's possible. But from the early to mid 90s, that really brought back some memories of frustration. Sounds like a dirty word.
Yeah. So there were variants of both Betamax and VHS. Betamax had Super Betamax, which was mostly a professional format. So Betacam rather.
Yeah, Betacam is, which was higher quality.
Higher quality, used a single cogwheel to drive tape through some sort of wizardry. I don't know how that would have worked. It was used in pro environments because the quality was, they wanted better than NTSC quality so that they could do edits without any loss by the time it went, without any noticeable image loss for the NTSC outputs.
Yeah. 120 lines of chroma versus the, 30 or 40 in the consumer Betamax?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's worth mentioning all of these analog formats. When you would do a copy of a copy, there's degradation each time. So by the time you got to a second or third generation output, there was a noticeable decrease in the quality, which is why you use professional quality cameras, even in the pre-HD days that had higher resolutions, like these Betacam devices. There was also VHS-C for the home market. There was a Betamax camcorders as well. There weren't very many of them. They didn't last for very long. But VHS-C was a electrically compatible mechanical, smaller mechanical VHS tape that was basically that you could basically put into a mechanical caddy that had a little motor in it that would like pull the tape out of the baby cartridge and put it where the big cartridge was expected to have tape in the player when you put it in the caddy, and then you could just plug that caddy into a normal VHS player and it would work right.
That's cool. I don't know that I ever saw VHS-C anywhere.
So that was mostly used in post shoulder mounted camcorders. When you had like a handy cam size camcorder, those were all VHS-C. And then in 1987, there was also Super VHS, which was available everywhere. Didn't really sell a whole lot of them, apparently. It upped the resolution on VHS to 400 lines effective, which was like 420 plus the VSync area, 420 minus the VSync area. And it was like Betacam, it was higher than NTSC resolution, which made it look good, and it was viable for professional like newsroom edits and stuff like that. It got used in learning environments a lot because it was cheaper than Betacam, but provided similar results. And it worked the same way as VHS. In fact, you could play VHS tapes in a Super VHS player. You generally couldn't play Super VHS tapes in a VHS player unless you had a special kind of VHS player that also understood how the Super VHS tapes worked, which would make them backwards compatible in some odd way.
Yeah.
There was also Super VHS ET, which lets you record on traditional VHS tapes, which were much cheaper, but at a higher quality than you could on a normal VHS tape usually.
Yeah. Yeah, this says Super VGS required S video for best results, which like who had S video access in 1987?
Hardly anyone, but SCART was taking off in Europe by then.
Europe, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
America got completely screwed on the SCART front for whatever reason. But
so I had S video by the time I bought my TV in 1993, probably when I went to college, my first TV.
Okay.
So it wasn't too far off.
Man, I was just going through old CRTs when I was at home last month.
Oh boy.
And because we still have all these TVs because I begged my parents not to throw them out. I did not get a TV with S video on it until 2001. I believe.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Xbox, GameCube era, huh?
Yes, PS2. I distinctly remember getting that TV and playing Final Fantasy X on it, if that tells you anything.
Well, so the interesting thing about the video formats is in the beginning of this time period, in the early 80s, you were probably using an FM modulator plugged into the antenna and tuning your TV to channel 3 or 4.
Yes.
Or 2, I guess. By the end of this, RCA inputs were pretty common on TVs by the late 80s. So you could get a signal that put the luminance and chroma on 2 wires and blasted them from your VHS player to your TV and let you record inputs as well. Same way.
Yeah. And then what is S video? Is like 6 pins? Is that right? I'm not.
S video is 5 or 6. Yeah. And it separates out the luminance and chroma, I believe, but not onto separate signals with a ground, I think is what it is. But
then you need component or RGB or SCART to split the colors out individually.
Yeah. To split the individual colors out.
This is for later. I talked about this on the Nextlander Ramblecast recently. I don't think I told you one of the old Trinitrons in the basement of my parents is one of the ones that's easy to mod for SCART.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Like
that's amazing.
It's like quite easy. I mean, I'm still afraid to open up a CRT, even though the thing hasn't been turned on in years, to be fair.
Well, if you have a screwdriver and are discharging capacitors, it's not bad.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to learn a lot of fundamental electrical concepts before I open up that TV someday and try to mod SCART into it.
You're probably, I mean, when was the last time it was plugged in? Like 30 years ago?
No, it was in use probably in the last decade at some point.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're in the danger zone then still.
The actual mod looks pretty easy in terms of soldering and stuff.
Brad, we have one simple rule here, which is don't electrocute yourself.
Okay, fine. If you insist.
So just to put a bow on the VHS beta conversation, who won? They sold a buttload of VHS players and they sold some Betamax players.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a beta deck. Outside, I take it back. I worked at GameSpot, so there were Betacam tapes everywhere for broadcast stuff, but I've never seen like a beta player in somebody's house ever.
I remember seeing them when I was a really little kid, then they all went away. Yeah, and I never ever went to a video store where you could rent beta tapes. Like by the time I was going to video stores, they were all gone.
Yes.
To give you an idea of what was going on in 1980, VHS had a 60% market share, which was I think the 40% mark for beta was the peak for them. And that was before the real explosion in sales that happened in the mid 80s.
You know, the expectation of acquiring licensing fees for this whole thing seems maybe a little foolhardy in retrospect on Sony's part.
Well, when we talk about digital formats, we'll get to the time that it worked out for them.
Sure.
But I think you're probably right. It definitely didn't work out in this case. They won the quality battle kind of and lost the war,
but just barely, right? So like that's the thing I've been waiting to say at the end of this conversation is, I mean, this podcast is good at making me check like sort of not urban legend, but like apocryphal stories about technology and stuff on a regular basis. But this is a big one where I've always assumed that story was correct about beta being like profoundly superior to VHS, or at least like appreciably so. You know, like the story was always like, oh, beta was better. VHS won out by being cheaper. You know, like the good enough thing always wins over the best thing. But this comparison makes them sound like they were on basically footing.
Yeah, I think so. Technology Connections talks about this quite a bit in their VHS and beta combos. I unfortunately don't have a beta player here to do side by sides on. I think in the modern context where we're used to looking at 4K plus video, I think both of them are going to look terrible in a way that is difficult to describe when you haven't looked at VHS video in a long time.
Yeah.
But I think that, so I did some more research on this, because speaking of urban legends, the thing I had always heard was that beta lost because Sony wouldn't allow pornography on the platform.
That's the other one that, yes, I've heard that one for years too.
Technology Connection said that was bunk, and I did some further digging, and after reading more, I think they're probably right. Mainly because Sony sold tapes, right? They didn't license the tapes to the people who made the content. There was nothing stopping people from putting pornography on Betamax other than nobody had Betamax players that they could sell pornography to.
Sure.
I think that the fact that the tapes couldn't hold a feature film for the most part was probably the deal breaker for Betamax as a going concern.
Yeah, like I said, being able to fit 6 hours on a tape was everything at that time.
But also, like, being able to fit Star Wars on a tape or Jaws on a tape was important, right? Yeah. You couldn't get a copy of Batman because Batman wouldn't fit on one Betamax tape.
Right.
You needed two.
Right.
It wasn't until much later on when Heat came out and Michael Mann was like, "Yo, we gotta get this thing out, but I'm not letting you EP this. This has got to be SP all the way through." So we had 2 tape sets of, I think, Heat and The Godfather were the 2 VHS movies I bought that had 2 tape versions. Yeah,
interesting. All right.
It was maybe Lawrence of Arabia. I can't remember. Anyway,
yes.
The upshot was VHS won because you could buy a 6-hour tape. I think that's probably fair.
Yes, VHS won, and then enjoyed, at least in the United States, enjoyed pretty much unchallenged market dominance until the late 90s. Like, DVD came out in 97, but it was still a year or two before that really started penetrating. So VHS was big for a long time.
It took a while before DVD players were cheap enough that a lot of people had them. But
yeah.
In the meantime, before DVD, the people who cared about quality had another alternative.
Way before DVD. Actually, that was another thing that blew me away in researching this episode, was how early LaserDisc was a thing.
So LaserDisc is not like, it's the interesting thing about this is that the time from launch to any kind of mass acceptance on all of this stuff was really slow by modern standards. Like, it took a long time before VHS, from between when VHS launched in 1976 to 1983 and 1984, when there were VHS players in a majority of US households.
Yeah.
LaserDisc likewise launched in 1978. It was originally under the name DiscoVision.
Yes. I
did not know that.
Yes. MCA. Also remember MCA.
Yeah. RIP MCA.
Speaking of old media companies that don't seem to be around anymore.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the Beastie Boy.
Oh, no. But yes, LaserDisc originally was brought to market and marketed by MCA under the name of DiscoVision.
That's amazing.
Before Pioneer later came along and I believe bought all the rights to the format, and then that's when they renamed it to LaserDisc and also used, I believe, the term LaserVision here and there.
I want to know if they had like a thing that played at the beginning of every movie that was like a dun 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 with like DiscoVision swooping in like 70s psychedelic text treatment.
Big mirror ball descending from the ceiling.
Yeah, crazy motion graphics.
As part of we should do some research on that. I had no idea the original, like the R&D, the technological development on optical storage technology, meaning, like same way CDs work. We're talking about a disc with pits and lands, little kind of trying to think, not grooves, but those are basically like gaps and high and low elevation, basically on a kind of microscopic scale on the disc, which are read by a laser. Like, that technology goes back to the early 60s from what I saw. Like, the first work on the optical and laser storage technology that went into LaserDisc started in like 1963. And then came to market by 1978. So like 2 years after VHS, LaserDisc was on the market, which is crazy to me.
So is it still doing pits and lands though, or is it doing an actual analog wave on the disc?
So that was probably the biggest thing about LaserDisc that I discovered in looking into this, because I've always wondered about that. So LaserDisc used analog audio and video primarily. As far as I can tell, it only ever used analog video, and it primarily used analog audio, but there were some limited uses of digital audio on LaserDisc.
Get Dolby Digital, I think, on some later. One of the digital Dolby formats. I don't know that it was actually Dolby Digital, but you could get one of the digital Dolby audio formats on some of the later LaserDiscs.
Might have been like AC3 or something like that. I think
that seems right.
That was a mid-'80s digital audio format. So the way it works is you're still using pits and lands, but it's the spacing between the lands are the raised parts, right, and the pits are the lower parts. It's the spacing that describes the kind of the frequency modulation of the analog signal. So if you go on Wikipedia, there's a nice little overlay that shows what are effectively digital pits and lands, right? They're just like cliffs, that's just like a square wave looking thing. But they overlay that with the analog signal, so you can see how the signal is transformed or how it interprets the spacing, the size of the gaps between the raised areas as
like the steepness of the curve or something.
Yes, basically. I'm sure there's math going on there that I don't understand. But when you look at it visually, it's actually like pretty easy to understand.
Oh, it's like the midpoint of the curve is at the end of the square waves.
Yes.
Wow, that is a trip.
Right. It's like, and again, it's something I've always wondered about, because to me, it was like, how could something be like CDs are digital, DVDs are digital? How could you be reading this with a laser in the format that optical discs are made in and get analog information off of it? And it turns out you're kind of transforming digital information into analog frequency modulation.
Wow, that is crazy. Okay.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's like FM radio almost.
Sure.
It's frequency modulated. Okay.
Yes.
Weird.
Yeah. So laser discs, they're giant CDs. Everybody knows what a CD is like. But laser discs predate CDs by I don't know how many years. CDs, I think, were mid 80s, right?
I think 84, 82. I can't remember.
But the technology that went into laser discs is what informed the creation of the CD, the DVD, like all these subsequent optical disc formats kind of descended from the tech that was developed for laser discs. So those basically were first in the optical storage realm. They were 12-inch discs. For our purposes, it's easiest to just say that each disc held 60 minutes per side NTSC or 64 minutes for PAL. There were discs that kind of spun at different speeds that held half that much.
Yeah, so it's about angular velocity versus linear velocity of the track, and whether it spun faster when you got closer to the center of the spindle or not.
Right, but for our purposes, in terms of like buying movies at retail on Laserdiscs, it was 60 per side, not 30 in the US. And
just for the vast majority of users, the thing you used a Laserdisc for was buying movies at retail.
Yes. So I don't have the chroma and luma information in front of me, but it was 425 lines for NTSC of resolution, so substantially better than what you were getting on the analog tapes of the time. Had chapter markers, chapter skipping, like DVD would later, which in the 80s was like completely unthinkable for anybody who'd never seen a Laserdisc.
It was magic. The first time I saw somebody with a Laserdisc, I was like, oh, wow, this is incredibly cool.
Yes. Originally, I would not have expected this. Apparently, originally, Laserdiscs were cheaper to make than tapes.
That makes sense, right?
When you think about it.
You stamp them.
Yeah, you're just stamping like a big piece of plastic. I mean, obviously, there are layers there. There's a substrate and stuff. You talked about how many moving parts are in a tape and how fragile they are. But that did invert over time. From what I gathered, it seemed like maybe the cost of materials like the plastic did not come down that rapidly, while, of course, economies of scale set in for VHS tapes. That ultimately made them way cheaper to make.
Well, and also replication, like replication facilities, because like to mass produce a tape, you had to put a master tape in and then copy a bazillion copies off of that at the second, so you didn't have a lot of generational loss, right?
Yeah.
So presumably there were facilities where they would load up 1,000 tapes and copy them all at once, but I'm sure we didn't have that in the early days.
Yes. Another advantage to Laserdiscs, we didn't really talk about this with tapes, and this also is relevant to the next bizarre format we're going to talk about, is durability. Because tapes wear out over time, although I don't think I ever had a retail tape like die, like break, or get truly unwatchable.
You could do it. It was hard. It usually was a fault of the player, it seemed like, or something got jammed in the cartridge, which would then jam up the works. Definitely
a tape deck could eat a tape if mechanically, like the tape could just get pulled out wrong and ruined that way. But I mean just like basic wear and tear from watching too much. Like I guess it is possible to wear a tape out eventually. Laserdiscs theoretically, like CDs, if you handle them perfectly in pristine conditions, they theoretically will last forever.
Store vertically in a cool, dry place.
Wait, was that actually a thing? Vertical?
You got to keep them vertical because they warp.
Oh,
and if they warp, they delaminate. And if they, ask me why, it's because I have a whole big box of them sitting in my office here.
Wait, hang on. Were you a LaserDisc guy?
No, my wife was a LaserDisc guy.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Wow. I gotta talk to her about that sometime.
When we first started dating, a friend of hers was like, I'm getting rid of all of my LaserDiscs. One of her old roommates was like, I'm getting rid of my LaserDiscs. Does anybody want them?
Oh, that's even better.
Fuck yes, I will take them.
Oh, that's even better than having to buy all your LaserDiscs yourself, is to just be bequeathed them.
Well, she did have to buy them, but it was at a fraction of the price.
Fire sale.
Yeah. We have, I think, The Godfather and Jurassic Park, not the Japanese Star Warses, but the pre-ruining Star Warses,
the pre-special edition, like the mid-90s. You're talking about the THX ones, the ones
normal
with
release,
with the covers that are like the half face of the Stormtrooper and Vader and Yoda.
No, these are before that. These are the ones that are still the watercolor paintings.
Oh, the poster art.
The poster art.
Okay.
Yeah.
I bought. Well, I never owned a LaserDisc player, but actually, I take that back. We have one that we got for free that was a hand me down from a school. Now, my parents might have gotten rid of it by now, but we had at some point a free LaserDisc player. But I did buy those THX Star Wars LaserDiscs, the very last release before the special editions came out. They're still factory sealed.
Ooh.
But I think they've been stored horizontally for 25 years.
We'll just put them on eBay. You don't have to tell anybody that. It's fine.
That might be the thing to do.
I think, as with many things around this era, there are a lot of things that you're told to do that are unclear what the provenance of that information is. I have no idea if that's how you're actually supposed to handle LaserDiscs. That's how I was told by my wife, who is our house's LaserDisc expert, it turns out.
Yes.
So the interesting thing about LaserDiscs is they were usually double-sided.
Yes.
Right. So in order to get 2 hours of movie on a LaserDisc, you had to get out and flip them over. Or if you were rich, you had a flipping LaserDisc player, which I assume had mirrors and two read heads, maybe, so that the laser would bounce up to the top. Or I don't know how that would have worked. But
what precision of mirror do you need? Well, maybe the tolerance was higher or was better than I would think. Like I would think that you would need some extremely precise mirror to make the laser. But
so I don't know how it worked in LaserDiscs, but often in analog stuff, the way the aiming circuit would work is it would be self-correcting based on signal strength. So when the signal strength got low, it would move it would reorient until it was until it was getting stronger signal again, just as a factor of the circuit design.
That's cool.
So yeah, LaserDisc was for a format that I think it's safe to say probably was a failure in the long run. It ran for a long time. People were buying LaserDiscs well into the 90s.
Yeah, Pioneer, actually, I believe I read Pioneer stopped making LaserDisc players only in 2009.
Yeah, the image quality was quite good.
Yeah.
Like the image, especially compared to VHS and Betacam or Betamax, but even compared to early DVD stuff, like the difference between the analog video and the MPEG-2 compression, we would often watch the LaserDisc versions of movies that we would have in multiple places.
Really?
Because the analog, like Jurassic Park was much like MPEG-2 was unkind to the dark scenes in Jurassic Park.
Sure. And
it worked pretty well on the LaserDisc.
Yeah. So makes sense. A couple other factoids about LaserDisc. Like you said, it did not catch on much in North America beyond kind of like a format for video files. Apparently it was quite big in Asia. Like it was very, very big in Japan.
Makes sense.
It was cheaper in Japan for whatever reason. Hong Kong is another market where it caught on. There's a lot of anime out there on LaserDisc. Common conception or misconception rather about LaserDisc that I held until I read about this stuff was that it was read only.
Oh no, they were writable ones, but not many people had them.
Yes, in fact, there were two different recordable LaserDisc formats. They were write once, read many formats, so you could only kind of like a CDR. Well,
okay,
there are rewritable CDRs, but you know what I mean. Like there were formats where you would buy a blank LaserDisc and could write to them once, and that was it. But from what I read, those were only ever marketed for professional uses. Basically, they were used for data storage in some cases, but they never really came to market in any kind of like consumer format. Yeah,
you could do there were computer backup solutions that used those, as I recall, for archival data.
Yeah,
I think they overestimated, as with CD, they overestimated the long-term viability of the LaserDisc as a backup media and archival media.
Yes.
What was the other one? What was the other recorder? There was just a rewritable one.
I don't believe there were any rewritable ones. I believe they were both.
So they weren't like the CD RWs and DVD RWs use dye that can be basically reset if you hit it with a certain frequency or power of laser. And I assume we hadn't gotten to that technology yet.
CRV discs, CRV component recordable video disc is the name of one of them. Those had to be stored in disc caddies.
Oh, because they were so fragile.
Yes.
Boy.
Recorded once per side. The recordable laser video disc was the other format.
Ah, yes. The RLV
function exactly like a CDR disc.
Okay.
Have to give a shout out to Dragon's Lair and what LaserDisc did for early FMV video games.
I don't think as a kid I realized that Dragon's Lair was like hand animated that was just skipping chapters on a LaserDisc.
Oh yeah.
I just thought that was what video games were supposed to look like. I was like, that's a good video game. All these others are crap.
Yes, there was a full-on LaserDisc player in every Dragon's Lair machine. American Laser Games, anybody? Makers of Mad Dog McCree.
I'm probably okay without the Mad Dog McCree, it turns out.
Who Shot Johnny Rock?
I never saw the only one of those I'm familiar with, I think, is Mad Dog. And that's only because of Giant Bomb stuff, because we had people who were big fans.
Yeah, I don't think I really saw those in arcades much at all back in the day, but I was familiar with them from magazines. And then they started coming out on things like 3DO after a while, once CD systems started getting big.
You could get Dragon's Lair for your MPC-1 computer.
Yes.
I never was. I don't know if anybody, was it possible to get good at Dragon's Lair?
Well, yeah, you could like memorize it. Sure. You could
just have to spend a lot of money.
Memorize the inputs and timing against each scene and beat it on one credit if you knew what you were doing. But
perfect arcade game.
Is that a fun use of your time? I'm not sure.
I don't know. You get to see the whole story, and I think people had special feelings about the female leads in most of those games.
That's yes, Daphne. Is that her name?
Daphne was the one in Dragon's Lair. I don't think I ever saw. I only saw the later Space Aces that weren't FMV games.
Yeah. The last thing about LaserDisc that I was reminded of in reading about this is that some movies still have yet to ever be released on a more recent format. There are some movies that last came out on LaserDisc, and that's basically the best and possibly only way to watch them.
Yeah, well, especially if you think about all the movies that the original prints were lost on recently, there's probably quite a bit of stuff that's only available on LaserDisc at this point.
Yes.
And I wonder, like, it's always interesting because, like, when the special editions of Star Wars came out, the early versions of the Harmy cuts and stuff like that used a lot of LaserDisc footage until there was, I think, a New Zealand broadcast of HD or something in HD or something that they ended up using for a lot of the other stuff. But anyway. Yes,
that's correct. So anyway, like, a lot of those LaserDiscs are very sought after today for movies and anime and stuff that has never come out on anything else. And there's a big scene around capturing those in increasingly higher qualities, which we should touch on at the end of this.
I was going to say that one of the interesting things that's come out in the last few years, and we'll talk about this at the end, but is that because this stuff is analog, your ability to pull, like, there's not an upper limit to the quality of the capture. I mean, there is an upper limit, but it's not a binary. Is it the good version or is it a less than the good version?
Yes.
Like it is with a DVD copy or something like that.
Yes. But it does turn out to be significantly higher quality than what any of the players on the market can produce. And
that's interesting.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that at the end. There's a fascinating scene around capturing analog video from some of this old media. Before we get there, we should do another little digression here into a failed format, and a bizarre, fascinating failed format.
I'd never heard of this one, Brad.
I've been aware of this for a while, but I wasn't super clear on how it worked. The capacitance electronic disc.
This is another format that I think we have to shout out Technology Connections, because they've done hours and hours and hours of videos about this thing.
They have like a 2-hour long series of videos about CED.
Yeah.
Which hit the market in 1981. It was made by RCA. Apparently started development in 1964.
Wow.
Although it started originally, so I mean, not to bury the lead here, CED functions like a record, like a vinyl record, like an LP, which is to say there is an actual stylus. There's basically a needle that reads the disc.
I'm making indistinguishable, incomprehensive noises.
So
how does that work?
But it's not picking up physical grooves, physical variations, the way a record player would, where the needle is actually like physically writing what it's playing.
Yeah.
In this case, that's where the capacitance in the CED name comes in. It's actually reading these information stored on the disk electrically. The stylus, the needle, for want of a better term, is capacitive, and it's basically forming a circuit with the disk as it's reading the data electrically from it.
Wow.
But it is still touching the disk. It is still physically touching the disk. In the course of development, they ended up putting a layer of silicone on the disk as kind of a lubricant to try to increase the longevity of both the stylus and the discs.
This already sounds like a bad idea, Brad.
Yeah. So the reason I mentioned that it works like a record player is that in the 60s, when they started working on this, originally it was an attempt to increase the amount of audio you could store on an LP,
so that your poets, your Depressed Poets Society album could fit on one CED disc instead of two.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, they accomplished that goal apparently very well. I didn't look at the ratio of how much more audio this could store than a regular vinyl record, but I'm sure it's quite large. But it languished in development for so long that by the time they had decided to make it a video format and got it done and to market, LaserDisc had beaten them by 3 years, and LaserDisc was already superior.
Wow.
It's a 12-inch disc, just like LaserDisc. It holds about the same amount. I think it's also 60 minutes per side. Probably the craziest thing about this format, if you've never seen it, is it turned out that these discs were incredibly susceptible to being disrupted by dust. Not just dust sticking on the disc, but apparently, like, if I understood, dust plus humidity contacting these discs would create permanent damage to the disc in some way or permanent distortion.
Because the dust could hold a charge?
During testing, it was shown that exposure to dust caused skipped grooves. If dust was allowed to settle on the discs, the dust would absorb moisture from the air and cement the dust particle to the disc surface.
Oh boy.
Causing the stylus to jump back in a locked groove situation. Thus, and I'll just read the rest of this because it explains their solution. Thus, an idea was developed in which the disc would be stored and handled in a plastic caddy from which the CED would be extracted by the player so that exposure to dust would be minimized. I put a very short video in the show notes that you can watch that is just somebody with a CED player showing how it works. It's literally like a record, like an LP size. You know what an album cover looks like for an LP?
Yeah.
It's like that. It's the cartridge is big and broad like that, big square with the movie poster on it. You stick that entire giant caddy into the player, wait about 3 seconds, and then pull the caddy back out. And at that point, the disc has been grabbed by the player and is stored inside, ready for playback.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
I'm watching this. This is a trip.
Yes, it's pretty wild. And the guy, and this is just one of these little throwaway YouTube videos where the guy just pointed a camera at his screen and player and talked over it for 3 minutes. But he mentions in there, he's like, yeah, this is known as a Skippy format, but if you're careful with your discs and you keep your player in good shape, it's really not a problem.
Wow.
So I don't believe CED had chapter markers the way LaserDisc did, but you could jog back and forth through it quite quickly. He shows that off in there. You can kind of fast forward like minutes at a time very quickly.
Do you have a sense of how dense were the grooves compared to like a traditional record?
The groove is 657 nanometers wide and has a length of up to 12 miles per disc.
So that's way bigger. That's way more dense than an LP, I think.
Yeah, I would think so. At any rate, one side effect of the way this thing works that occurred to me is that this was a way to, you know how people display LP album art? Sometimes they frame it or put it up on the wall in their homes. This would have kind of been a way to get a cool version of that for movies, because that's what these caddies were exactly, was just a big record cover looking movie poster display thing. Would have been a cool way to do some found art later.
I mean, they look like giant. They look like well, so there was a moment when Blu-ray was being developed where it was thought that it was going to have to be in caddies too, because they hadn't figured out how to make the discs not scratch. And scratches disrupted the grooves were so fine that scratches were very disruptive.
Yeah, I wrote this in the notes. Can you help me remember in what capacity CD caddies were used in the early days of CD-ROM? Like, did some CDs ship in caddies, or was it?
Some players had caddies.
That's what it was. Some CD-ROMs had caddies, and you put the disc in the caddy and then loaded the caddy, correct?
Yeah. So my first CD-ROM player was a caddy CD-ROM player.
Okay.
And it was because it spun at 2x speed, I believe, which meant that I don't know. I assume it needed the caddy because they couldn't spindle it up at high speeds or something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, so fast forward, smooth fast forward and rewind from the video that I saw on the CD.
Yes.
What a weird format.
You could pause it, but you didn't get a freeze frame of the video.
Oh, did it just stop?
Because it kept spinning, and it couldn't just hang. It couldn't linger on one single frame because it just kept spinning, so. Sorry, I think I totally glossed over the video quality of this thing. It was about 240 lines of resolution, so this actually did not look much better than VHS and Beta of the time.
Oh, that seems well. And also, it wasn't durable. Like RCA said, you could only play 500 times or something.
That was the other thing, is that RCA, the manufacturer themselves, estimated that a retail movie could be played back about 500 times.
That means it's not much better for wear than a VHS tape.
Right. So, I mean, granted, are you really going to watch a movie that you bought 500 times? Probably not very often.
I'm going to go and tell you, if you have kids and you buy movies for them to watch, often I assure you, I've seen Frozen 500 times in 11 years of my daughter's life.
That's fair.
Probably also The Little Mermaid.
Yes. Anyway, that's why I mentioned earlier that LaserDiscs theoretically could be played forever. Obviously, there are plenty of other factors involved there, but that was explicitly not the case with this other competing disc format, that CEDs were going to wear out relatively quickly.
What a weird thing. Like,
yes.
I've I have unlike the LaserDiscs and the different tape formats, I have absolutely no exposure to this in a real world context at all. I never saw one of these, I don't think.
It did not last long. It launched in 1981 under the name Selectavision.
It's a pretty good name.
That's a good ass 80s product name, actually.
Why do you think they called it Selecta? Is it because you could select where to drop the needle and play it at any time?
I don't know. Maybe.
Do you think you could like DJ it and like spin release the motor and like spin the video like you would if you were a hip hop DJ? It's kind of amazing.
Open up the top of your player to do that, I guess.
You'd have to have a clean room, probably, given how dust prone they were.
Sure. Anyway, like I said, by the time they came out, LaserDisc was already better. So this really did not go anywhere. It came out in 81. They stopped making players by 84, and they stopped making movies in 86.
Dead format.
Yep. But a fascinating one.
You know, it lasted longer than HD DVD.
Yeah, fair. That's true.
Next on the list are some home video formats, notably Video 8. This was in 1985. It's pretty much also ended up being a Sony format, but was co-developed with Kodak, JVC, Hitachi, Matsushita / Panasonic, and Philips. In 1986, most of the partners that weren't Sony announced plans to embrace VHS-C for their cameras instead. And the main benefit of Video 8 was a smaller, skinnier cartridge, so you could do high quality video on like Handycam style camcorders. It was not compatible in any way with VHS, but because everything had RCA plugs, the camcorder and your VHS player, it was pretty easy to do a one generation loss transfer from the camcorder to a VHS player or whatever.
God, this is making me realize how long and varied Sony's history is of trying to create their own formats that they control. Like, yeah,
I think this was a natural offshoot. Like the VHS, the Video 8 stuff, the video quality on it was noticeably better because it had more lines of resolution. I wasn't now I say that I wasn't actually able to find a clear definition of what the Video 8 format was. I'm sure it's out there. I'm going to get a bazillion comments. It was the upgraded version, High 8, which came out in the late 80s or early 90s, gave you 400 total lines of resolution, of which there was still some split off for the VSync, but you got a better than NTSC basically format. But it worked with NTSC or PAL, just like VHS and Beta.
Yeah, but I mean, sorry, from Betamax to this to Video 8 to was Minidisc. Proprietary? Was that proprietary or no?
Minidisc was absolutely proprietary. Right. Yeah.
Like to the various memory stick formats that they tried to foist on people instead of SD cards. Like Sony really, I think they may have finally learned their lesson, but that was probably mostly forced by the kind of end of physical formats. You say they finally learned their lesson, but Blu-ray is now more than 15 years old almost, and 10 years old, and it turns out, they get a check every time somebody buys a Blu-ray disc. Oh yeah. So it was all worth it, I'm sure. Yeah. They finally, all you need is the last one, it turns out, and you win. Yes. So High 8 came out in the early 90s. It was better resolution Video 8. Those Video 8 tapes will play in a High 8 camera, but not the other way around, obviously. And we'll talk about it next time, but there was a later extension to High 8 that made it digital in the early 2000s. These were basically camcorder formats that you bought the tapes that you needed for the camcorder you had, and that was pretty much it. That's when tapes started getting small. I have a High 8 VHS, High 8 camcorder that I bought in the late 90s. That's cool. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I'm sure it was. We should talk about Sony HDVS briefly here. It's kind of out of scope for this episode because it never became a home format, although it might have in an alternate universe. Yeah, this is my grandparents were super stoked about this in the 80s. Really? Yeah, they were. My grandparents loved a good advance in TV. Oh wow, I'm very impressed they even knew about this. So my grandmother, her dad, when they were kids in England, in pre-war England, hung like literally hand built a radio and ran copper wire around the crown molding of their living room. Man. So they could listen to the first broadcast on BBC One when she was a kid. That's amazing. Right? Like the long history of being into the new technology shit, I guess, in my family. That is rad. The Sony HDVS really never proceeded past like a very expensive production setup, but it was their first attempt at analog HD video at a time when it had not been standardized yet. And they did a lot of like press tour stuff with this. I
if I had to guess, my grandmother knew about this because of Newsweek would probably be the place she would have picked it up.
I can see that. They kind of, from the sound of it, they basically jumped the gun. They kind of tried to predict what they thought was going to be the analog high definition broadcast standard and kind of develop that preemptively. They did end up with an analog video pipeline that Wikipedia described it as a resolution of 1125 lines, but only 1035 active ones. So I guess there's something in the overscan, or I'm not sure exactly.
It's probably VSync and metadata would be my guess.
But not far off at all from the 1080p that people finally settled on for the digital high definition standard.
It wasn't 16:9 though.
It was later, so I think it. I don't have it in front of me right now. I think it was like 5:4 was the original ratio, but then it became 16:9 in the late 80s. I believe by the late 80s it had become 16:9. Yeah, 5:3. 5:3 was the original aspect ratio, and then later 16:9.
Okay, so that's 15:9 basically.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
At any rate, this never made it home. There was never any home format that this was distributed on. There were no TVs that could display it at the time. So obviously, apparently, when this came out, it came out in 1986, and a basic production setup which was literally one camera, a monitor, and a tape recorder, was $1.5 million.
Wow!
And the tapes cost $2,500 per hour of tapeable footage.
Do you think this is because of the cameras and stuff where it was basically built by hand?
Maybe
like these are one-offs.
I don't know. From what I read, it sounds like they sold these production setups in the dozens at best.
That seems right
for how expensive it was. It was used here and there. Like a couple of feature films were shot on it, a couple of TV movies, a fair number of concert films from the sound of it. The Genesis Invisible Touch Tour apparently was shot on this. Very, very limited use in production. And, in most cases, if somebody even saw footage shot with this, it was transferred to film and shown in theaters or shown over NTSC, which would have lost a lot of the quality anyway over broadcast.
Yeah, you sent me some YouTube videos that seemed to be ripped from like a high quality analog source that were really, it's funny. When I watched them at first, I didn't clock anything as being weird about them. But then when you pointed out what I should be looking for, I was like, oh, right. All of this stuff is stuff that you don't see on modern digital equipment. Yeah,
I've got a link in the show notes. The Sony, the Metamorphosis demo from 1990 is like fairly famous. I think it's only been about 4 years ago, maybe less, that somebody found like an original copy and captured it in high definition.
Wow.
But it is high def analog video. So it's like roughly the resolution of 1080p that you're used to, but with all of the characteristics of analog video, like in this, there's a bunch of footage of like kind of a dance party in a studio here. And you see like every time the camera pans across the studio lights, you get those like streaky after images, kind of trails on the bright lights and stuff. It's just kind of uncanny to me to see something this clear and crisp from the late 80s, but with those hallmarks of what analog video looked like back then.
I also wonder if watching them on an analog TV instead of being filtered through the YouTube digital compression thing, the pipeline would make them stand out even more. Because like there's a thing that happens with brains where, like when DVD was popular and like I was getting digital cable and digital satellite TV, we're both MPEG-2 compression on every channel. Your brain eventually started filtering out all the MPEG-2 compression artifacts. When you go back and watch MPEG-2 video now, the compression artifacts are really, really visible and really stand out. I assume the same things happen with the stuff that H.264 and H.265 and at some point in the future AV1 will do as well.
Yeah.
But my bet is that this looks on a CRT, this would look remarkable.
Probably. Yeah. Unfortunately, not a lot of HD CRTs around to see.
No, sadly, no.
At this point, I do wish whoever had gotten their hands on the hardware in this tape and had captured it had put out a kind of raw version that hadn't run through the shitty YouTube compression.
Yeah,
it would be a cool historical artifact to have. The other reason I was going to say this footage is very famous, at least to me, and this is going back to being in like Mr. Land. This was used in all kinds of other Sony contexts, like the PlayStation 1 developer disc that they put out that demos a bunch of what the PlayStation 1 can do.
Wait, what?
Uses this footage on it, except in like shitty low quality motion JPEG or whatever codec. The
Video
PlayStation
CD
1
is what they CDB1, I think.
Right. And that CD, it's also got the famous T-Rex 3D model on it. But that CD lets you like map this video onto a bunch of like floating spheres and cubes and do weird manipulations on it. So like,
wow.
Sony used this footage in like R&D and like test and development contexts for a long time after they shot this. So it's like, it's pretty visible. So it's cool that somebody went back and found the original quality version.
That's a trip. So I think that takes us to the end of the analog scene for the most part.
Pretty much, yeah.
I'd be curious if people feel like we missed something, please let us know. Yeah. Techpod@content.town is the email address. Should we talk about, I want to talk about the duping, the preservation scene for this stuff. Because like there's a lot of really amazing stuff happening with people, it's the right time for it to happen because we're reaching the end of life on a lot of older analog tapes now, especially if they weren't stored in pretty stable conditions. But yeah, I'm curious what's going on with the preservation scene. Brad?
Yeah, I'm just going to describe this from memory because I haven't dug into it too much. Like this would be a whole episode unto itself, and I wouldn't even undertake that episode unless I actually buy some of this equipment and try to start doing some of it, which I have considered.
We could have an expert guest on for this one.
We certainly could. But I want to mess with this. Like I've got some use cases for this that I'm kind of waffling on whether it's worth getting into or not. There's kind of multiple projects, some hardware, some software in open source that have kind of come together to make all this stuff happen. The oldest one I'm familiar with is LD-Decode, which is straight up just a GitHub repository you can go find, which, as you might expect, stands for LaserDisc Decode. That has been used in combination with a device called, I believe the pronunciation is the Doomsday Duplicator, even though it's spelled like a Domesday.
Okay. Which
I believe is some UK listeners are yelling at the radio right now. I think it was some kind of educational broadcast or something.
Is this the made for TV movie that freaked everybody in the UK out?
No, I don't think so. I think that's oh God, what is the name of that movie? It's on the tip of my tongue. I know what you're talking about. The post-apocalyptic nuclear war one.
Yeah.
That's not Threads, is it?
I don't know.
I believe that's Threads, the 1984. I'm looking at it now. TV movie.
It is Threads. Yeah.
Yes, I've heard that movie spoken about in hushed tones for a long time.
I have British friends who have been like, yeah, don't watch that. It's bad.
Yeah. Yes,
it'll mess you up.
That movie has been infamous on forums and stuff for a long time.
Right up there with the Grave of the Fireflies in terms of things I'm never going to watch.
Very much so. I don't know what the origin of the term Doomsday is in this context, but long story short, let me cut to the chase here on what the hardware element of why this is interesting. And now there is a VHS decode that has descended from the LD decode project, which kind of does the same thing for VHS, as you might imagine. Here's what they're doing, though. And the hardware has an FPGA in it. Like it's a whole development thing you need to put together on multiple boards. That's like $350. It's not trivial.
It's not too bad, though.
Not too bad. What these devices are doing is going into LaserDisc players and VHS decks that expose this functionality and tapping directly into the RF signal that's coming straight off the media.
Oh, off of the read head. So before it goes through all the image processing.
Exactly. Before it touches any of the video output hardware in that specific player, and whatever transforms and reduction in quality happen as it goes to screen.
Oh, so you get the benefit of the high quality analog read heads, and you run it through modern video processing signal?
Yes, you are getting the purest possible analog signal off of the given media, whether it's VHS tape or LaserDisc or what have you. So it's within some margin of error because, like you said, you're still having to run it through some processing and try to like massage it to look right. But it's effectively the highest quality you can possibly pull off of that media because it's basically exactly the information stored on the disc, give or take.
Well, that's fascinating.
It's awesome. It's amazing. Yes. So that's where people are at with that stuff. And that's why I specifically mentioned the thing about LaserDiscs kind of still holding some movies up, from any newer formats. Like that's kind of the only way you can watch stuff. There are people out there you can see on Twitter, like Chris Person, who works with Aftermath and a number of other places. Like he's big into this scene. He's Papa Pishu, Pishu on Twitter. He tweets about this stuff all the time. He actually is one of those people who's like getting their hands on obscure anime and stuff like that doesn't exist outside of LaserDisc or exists in very poor quality otherwise.
Yeah.
And is making very high quality backups or captures of it to preserve for historical value.
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about it because I've been doing work at PC World a couple of days a week the last couple months, and they used to host Macworld, and also hosted PC World event keynotes and stuff where like things that we talked about in that Pirates of Silicon Valley episode a couple of weeks ago happened. And when you go look at the YouTube videos of those events, they're not great.
Oh,
I want to find. Yeah, it's fascinating.
I've talked to Adam before about some of the stuff they might have lurking on old tapes from from like Apple keynotes and stuff that might be of immense historical value.
Like iPhone keynote.
Yes.
Would be amazing to get. Yeah.
Absolutely. I've mentioned that specific one to him for sure. But yeah, cool. Like anyway, that's where the efforts are at these days for kind of trying to capture and preserve stuff that's locked up on these old analog formats. There are a couple of cheaper options that are similar to this that are almost as good. There's one that uses like a $30 capture card off of AliExpress that's apparently like pretty close.
And do you have to like take apart the VCR and solder stuff in? Okay.
I don't know about soldering. So I've never gotten that far into looking down the rabbit hole.
Okay.
You might be soldering stuff, or you might be just clamping onto things. I'm not 100% sure.
I mean, my guess is you're soldering onto stuff on the bottom of the board just so you have like extra bleeds coming off. But
yeah, and it requires compatible players. Not every player apparently makes it easy or possible to do this. So there's also the necessity of hunting down. But apparently it's pretty easy. Like you see people all the time say like, "Oh, I found like one of these Panasonic Blue Line players at Goodwill for $5 that is now my capture setup." So they're still out there. I'll mention for anybody who listening to this who messes with this stuff, my use case, the thing I've thought about doing with this is we've got some old VHS home movies from the 80s that were recorded on an 80s era VHS camcorder, which, as you can imagine, are not great quality.
180 lines for a lot of those, it turns out. Yeah.
So like my thought there is like, yes, they're very low quality because of the hardware of the era, but still, if I could lift those from the tapes at the best quality possible, given the limitations, is that worth it or not? We got them captured and put on DVD a few years ago, but I don't know that those captures were conducted in the best possible way, and they're MPEG-2 compressed now.
Those are often like not done at a high quality.
Right. Like I'm guessing that's whatever setup my mom sent them to, or some kind of prosumer deck that was probably going out of S-Video at best or something into some kind of PC capture of 10 years ago plus. So anyway, I'm debating, like, is it worth going down this rabbit hole to try to get these home movies, this family stuff, which is very sentimental in a higher quality? I'm not sure.
I mean, my general advice on that is it's better to get it while the tapes still work.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
Than to wait for the perfect transfer and hope that you have a way to do it better at some point in the future.
It's not waiting for a better option. Is it worth? Is there actually even going to be a noticeable difference from the DVDs that we already have? And that I can't answer.
I mean, you probably won't have the good stock music. So that's it. That's the tour. Part one, we'll call that. That's the analog edition of the history of home video.
Mm-hmm.
The CED stuff was the big revelation for me. I'd never heard of that. And also I was shocked at how little the difference in quality on beta and VHS was, given all the beta people's yelling about how good beta was.
Yes, that was a revelation.
Yeah. If you think beta is better, please don't leave a comment. We're fine.
No, not a big beta resurrection scene out there from what I've seen.
I don't know, man. People yell about anything, but you know what I do love?
What's that?
Is our listeners.
Me too.
Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod is a listener supported podcast. That means without listeners like you, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be making a show. So I
love them, not least of all because they keep us going.
Yeah, because they if you would like to find out how you can support the show monetarily, which we appreciate in these times especially, you can go to patreon.com/techpod. Again, it's patreon.com/techpod, and where for $5 a month you gain access to the fabulous TechPod Discord. You get access to a wonderful community of nerds just like you who love to talk about things like, is beta better than VHS, or what the hell is this CED thing anyway? I've never heard of that. That seems like something Brad and Will made up on this episode. But no, there's 2 hours of Technology Connection videos out on the internet. You can go watch and learn more about it right now. Again, it's patreon.com/techpod. And while we thank all of our listeners every month and all of our patrons every month, we give an extra special thank you to our executive producer tier patrons, including Andrew Slosky, Paddle Creek Games, makers of Fractured Veil, Jordan Lippett, Octothorpe Bunny Redacted, Just Wedge, Twinkle Twinkie, David Allen, James Kamek, and Pantheon, makers of the HS3 high-speed 3D printer. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you.
Yes, we do.
And on that note, I think we'll sign off for the week. I think we should give it a rest between this week and this one and the part two, though. I think we should. I think we should give it a minute to stew. I think we should maybe consult a friend next week and see if there's a fun project out there for people.
Oh, interesting idea.
I mean, who knows what we're going to do? Tune in next week and find out. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you then.